Hello, this is Nate with STEMforged. Today we're going to take a look at exporting 3D models from Blender over to Blocksmith. It's a fairly straightforward process, but there's a few things you're going to want to keep in mind. We're going to take a look at scaling, smoothing, setting up materials, formatting the model for animation, and a little bit of texturing. All right, let's take a look. So we can see here in Blocksmith, our player character, they should be maybe roughly about 6 feet tall or so, approximately. So in Blender, we can add a plane and extract it upwards. Usually about 6 feet is about maybe 1.83 meters or so. So if we extract this up, we've got a cube now that is about 6 feet tall. And you can rename this. You can use this in your scene just to kind of have a reference to about how tall the player is in Blocksmith as well. So we'll name this player height ref. When you're exporting from Blender, I suggest to use OBJ. Sometimes for whatever reason, when you're importing it into Blocksmith, if you use FBX, sometimes it'll come in at the correct size, sometimes it's way too big, and sometimes it's way too small. But I found that if you export from Blender using OBJ, it will come in at the correct size consistently. Whatever it's scaled to in Blender is how it will import into Blocksmith. So let's give it a try. Okay, we'll export this out. Now to load it in to Blocksmith, you just go under your special tab, you grab the model import. I recommend for scaling purposes, again, don't use load FBX GLTF. That just seems to not always be consistent with the size. You can go under load model, upload, load model, and then select your OBJ that you just exported from Blender. And it should come in. We'll hit upload on this as is for now. Select our player size ref. And look at that, it's just about the same height as our player character. All right, so now we need an actual 3D model that we can use. I've got some reference photos here. We'll get the model put together and we'll see you back in just a minute. So when we're putting our models together in Blender, one thing you want to think about is animating it. Unfortunately, at this time, Blocksmith does not support keyframed animation. So if you animate your object here in Blender, or if you rig it up with an armature and animate it, that information is not going to transfer over to Blocksmith. It has a different sort of animation system. But no worries, we can set our model up in Blender so we can animate it over in Blocksmith. Let's take a look. So we've got our example 3D model here in Blender. When we're animating it, we want this top propeller to be able to spin, we want this back propeller to spin, and then we want this entire object to be able to lift up like it's flying. So anything you want to be able to animate in Blocksmith, ideally you want to have it as a separate object here in Blender. So you can create an animation for that actual object itself in Blocksmith. So we've got 3 pieces. We've got the main helicopter, this top propeller, and this back propeller, all as separate objects here in Blender. So we'll select all 3 of these objects, export it out as an OBJ, selection only. We'll name it as helicopter test. Okay, and then we export these 3 separate pieces out as one OBJ from Blender. So we're going to import our model that we just exported from Blender. You drag and drop in your model import special. We want to use load model, go to upload, load model, select this helicopter test that we just exported from Blender. Go ahead and upload that. Okay, great. We've got our models, select it and click load. Okay. One thing you might notice, you go to animated, it won't let you actually select the model or the separate pieces. If you delete this model import special, okay, boom, there we go. Now we've got our helicopter. And we can see it has its 3 separate pieces sort of grouped. Great, all right, so now we can start doing our animation. Okay, we'll go do this, okay, loop forward, looks good. We'll select this upper one, rotate this as well, loop forward. Everything should be fine, right? And then we can, look, you can see what happened here. This little back propeller, and even this top propeller now, everything sort of flies out of place and it's not fitting correctly how it should. So that can be a little frustrating, but no worries. I have a workaround. We'll go ahead and take a look. So you want to ungroup it. Okay, great. Now we have 3 separate objects. Now we can create the animations. Okay. Spin this around. Loop. Grab this little guy. Spin this around. Oops. I want to do an animation. Okay, we make this back propeller animation. Oops, there it goes. Okay, loop forward. Okay, great. So now these 2 propellers, ungrouped, have their animations. Now we can select all 3 of these separate pieces and group them back together. Okay, let's take a look and see if it looks better this time. Great, okay, now they're in the right spot. They're animating how they're supposed to. And now we can even add an animation here. So we'll make it look like our helicopter is taking off and maybe hovering. Oops, okay, perfect. Oh, look at that. And now it's got the propellers animating, everything is together as it should be. So yep, if you're having problems with doing the animation and parts are flying off incorrectly, just remember you import it, you ungroup your model, animate the separate pieces, regroup it, and then you can animate that grouped object if you need to as well. All right. All right, so if you want to make your model look a little more interesting or give yourself some more options in Blocksmith, you can set up materials. So let's say we wanted to give our helicopter some windows. All right, you go over here, you select your model, add a material, call it helicopter body. Okay, we'll make it a nice, maybe a nice dark blue. Okay. Okay, now let's add in some windows. Let's see, maybe something like this. Maybe one over here, and maybe one over here. Okay. Create a new material slot. Let's call it helicopter windows, and assign that. Okay, that's looking a little more realistic, a little more interesting. Okay, and just to make it a little more visually appealing, we'll add one more material slot to our model. We'll select these and we'll maybe do some little accents or a different color. So let's make a new material slot, call it helicopter accents. Make it a nice contrasting orange color. All right, our helicopter's looking a lot more interesting now. Another thing to note is Blocksmith does support smoothing or smoothing groups. So you can see here it's got kind of this flat shading on it. It's got that low poly look. You can see the geometry. So if you want it to look a little more realistic, you can right click and shade smooth. And now it'll kind of smooth out some of those faces and make it look a little bit nicer over in Blocksmith. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look and see what our model is looking like now when we bring it over with these materials assigned. All right, so now we've got our model with its materials over in Blocksmith. You can see it looks a little kind of smoother now too, that we added that smooth shading. One thing to note is when it imports, Blocksmith doesn't let you have more than one material on one object. So it'll sort of take your materials that you assign and split them up into separate sort of sub-objects that are grouped together. So just something to keep in mind. But now that we've got our materials set up, we can go in and start changing them around. Maybe we want to make it, a different color. You can use some of the pre-built materials that come with Blocksmith. So let's make this like rusty accents here. So yeah, it kind of just gives you more options for the way your model looks in Blocksmith. If you want to take it to the next level, we can add some texture maps to our model. One thing to note is Blocksmith at this time does not support PBR textures. Like the color map or the diffuse map will carry over, but things like a roughness map or metallic map or like normal maps aren't supported in Blocksmith at this time. So we'll go ahead and get our model unwrapped and get it set up and do some quick textures, and we'll see what that looks like in Blocksmith. All right. You can use any software you prefer for texturing. I like Substance Painter for hard surface stuff, but you can use like Quixel or Armor Paint, or you can even do texture painting, directly here in Blender. But once you've got your texture maps, we can go ahead and apply them here in Blender. One thing to note, kind of like we talked about before, only this base color or your diffuse map will actually translate over to Blocksmith. If you've got things like a roughness map or a metallic map or like your normal map here, that unfortunately will not translate over into Blocksmith. All right, so we've got our texture maps applied here in Blender. We'll go ahead and export out our model for Blocksmith. So we've still got the 3 separate parts to use for animation in Blocksmith. Select all 3 pieces, and we want to export them all out again as one OBJ. If you use OBJ, the texture maps will transfer over to Blocksmith. Okay, so we select OBJ, selection only. We'll save this as helicopter final. Okay, great. Okay, so back over in Blocksmith, again, we're going to go under Special, Model Import. We want to use Load Model again. Go under Upload, Load Model. We've got our OBJ that we exported from Blender with the texture maps. We'll select that. Okay. And you can see that it already comes in, since we set up the textures in Blender, it'll come in with those texture maps already applied. One thing to note is if you have like an OBJ file that's already unwrapped, it's OBJ format, you've already got a texture map, you don't necessarily have to import it into Blender, apply the texture and re-export it. You can just do this model import, select your OBJ file, and then if you go under Add Texture, you can actually select and upload your diffuse or texture map that way. But we don't need to worry about that since we already did it in Blender. All right, so we'll click upload. Here we are. And let's load this in. Okay, now we've got textures here in Blocksmith. So you can see, yep, the normal maps didn't carry over. It's just the color map, but still pretty nifty and looks pretty cool. All right. Okay, so now we have our helicopter from Blender finally here in Blocksmith. We've got materials set up. I added some Blocksmith materials to it. Set up the animations. Let's take a look at what it looks like here. So we've got our stem forge chopper. Walk over and click on it and oh, it's taken off. All right, pretty nifty. Okay, so we talked about formatting our models in Blender and exporting them over to Blocksmith. We looked at using OBJ exports so the models retain their size and scaling. We looked at using separate objects in Blender so we can animate them in Blocksmith, as well as setting up materials and smooth shading in Blender, and how to import custom texture maps into Blocksmith. Hopefully this has been helpful for you and you can go out and start creating some awesome models in Blender and bring them to life in Blocksmith. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos. And thanks for watching.